Okay, welcome everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen right now. I've never had this button disappear. Here it is. All right, hopefully you can see this little PowerPoint here. Let me switch displays. There we go. Okay. Now we're set. Well, welcome everybody to the last of our NACADA Core Value Series sessions. This is session number 4. And I'm super excited with our presenter here today. I'm going to introduce her in a second, but she needs no introduction at all. But again, thank you. This is a unique series that we've done. We've mapped it out over the course of several months. And broken it down into 4 sessions. And just to give a little context, like I do at the beginning of the last few ones we've done, we want to just talk a little bit about what the core values are. So the NACADA has their 4 pillar documents of academic advising, their concept of academic advising, the core values of academic advising, the core competencies of academic advising, and then the CAS standards they list as their 4th pillar document. And these can all be found on the NACADA website. But the core values of academic advising, they actually are also one of the conceptual competencies. So by that, all advisors should aspire to understand what the NACADA core values are and try to apply them to their practice. They're basically a statement of core values basically reflects the cultural and educational context in which academic advising is practiced. They're the core values of the advising profession as a whole. They apply to all who perform advising. So by any role, by any title, faculty advisors, primary role advisors. So they're all, subject to these core values. All the values, all 7 of them are of equal importance. They represent not so much what we do, but who we are. So these are kind of the things we aspire to be as practitioners and who we want to become as well. And they are really critical guideposts for our practice. So kind of what we believe as advisors. And they do influence how we act, right? So that's why they're important. And so today we're going to focus on the last 2 of the 7, professionalism and commitment. And I am super excited for our presenter today, Shawntae Harris Mintline. She is currently the director of Southeast Michigan and the Detroit Center for Grand Valley State University. So previously, as you know, she was the associate director of academic programs and institutional effectiveness at Wayne State and spent 7 years as an academic advisor at Wayne State and at Washtenaw Community College. She's been a NACADA member for nearly a decade and has served as the chair of the Education Majors Advising Community and currently chairs the NACADA Research Grants Subcommittee. She's presented multiple times at NACADA's annual conference and has, including scholarly paper sessions and as a discussant for scholarly research. She is a doctoral candidate in the PhD in Leadership in Academic Advising program at Kansas State University with research focused on the math attitudes of academic advisors and their impact on advising conversations. That sounds really interesting. So welcome, Shawntae, and I'm gonna stop sharing real quick and make sure that you have co-host privileges.
Oh, yeah.
But feel free to get started while I do that.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see all of you. I'm really excited that even though I took a new job, Kate still let me come and do this. So I really appreciate it. All right, let me get my screen shared and then we'll get started. All right. All right. You guys seeing my screen here?
Mhm.
Okay, good. All right. So Kate already kind of gave us a little bit of an overview, but we're going to be talking about the commitment and professionalism core values for NACADA. And of course, this is the last in a series that you've done, and I'm really excited to kind of wrap this up with everybody. About me, Kate read my bio. So it's kind of like, who am I? Why am I talking about this? Because I don't work there anymore. But as she said, I've been really involved with NACADA for a long time. I continue to be, even though I'm not a primary role advisor right now. I've moved into other roles, but I consider myself an advisor at heart, and I will be soon hiring advisors to work for me here at the Detroit Center for Grand Valley. And I feel like when I move through spaces, I'm always thinking through an advisor lens. And I truly believe that my position at Grand Valley and also my associate director position at Wayne State, I got pretty much because I was an academic advisor, because I had experience and I could see things through like an academic advising lens. And I think that's really valuable, especially as I've sort of moved into more of an academic affairs space. I'm in the second cohort of Kansas State's Leadership and Academic Advising program, which is housed out of Kansas State University, which is also where NACADA is housed, for those of you that may or may not have known that. And so I've just finished my preliminary exams last fall, and I'm dissertation writing right now. But it's really exciting to be in one of like it's the only doctoral program, and there are only a handful of other graduate programs in academic advising, which we'll talk about when we talk about the advising profession here in a second. This is the overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a bit about advising as a profession, and then we'll talk about the definitions of both commitment and professionalism as defined by NACADA. And we'll talk a little bit about what those things look like in action, like what do we actually do? What might we do to do those things in our daily work? We'll talk a little bit about how these concepts sort of intersect. I think Kate very brilliantly matched up the core competencies in a really smart way, and commitment and professionalism make a lot of sense together. And when we look at them side by side, you'll really see how they align. We'll do a couple of activities, no low stress activities. So hopefully people don't feel like they have to leave at the end. I'm one of those people that sometimes will jump out of a Zoom if they say we're going into breakout rooms, but don't panic when we get to that point, because it's not going to it'll be painless, I promise. And then we'll just do some wrap up and reflection on what we discussed. Let's get started. I get to gloss over this because Kate already did it. But as Kate said, the core competencies are one of the four pillars of academic advising. I'll come back to this concept later. So I'm glad that Kate talked about it in detail because she did it much more eloquently than I could have. But again, one of the and the core competence, or excuse me, the core values are one of fall under the conceptual core competencies of NACADA. So they all kind of are intersect. There are 7 core values you all have already talked about, almost all of them. And so we're going to wrap up here with our commitment and professionalism. And so I will read this, and you also have it on your screen to follow along. But I just want to make sure we all have like the definitions of each of these from NACADA in the front of our mind as we move forward. So commitment, the core value of commitment is defined as academic advisors value and are dedicated to excellence in all dimensions of student success. Advisors are committed to students, colleagues, institutions, and the profession through assessment, scholarly inquiry, lifelong learning, and professional development. And professionalism. Academic advisors act in accordance with the values of the profession of advising for the greater good of students, colleagues, institutions, and higher education in general. So, we're going to go through and kind of break down the different components of this and talk about where they overlap, and also talk about some underlying pieces of this that aren't explicitly stated here, but it's helpful for us to understand as we think of how we do these core values in practice. And so, as Kate mentioned, one of the 4 pillars of academic advising is are also the CAS standards. So I'm not going to read through the CAS standards for you, but just know that if you haven't seen the CAS standards, I have the big blue book. Oh no, you can't really see it. Which they don't make anymore. Now you can only get the CAS standards online. So the 10th edition was the last CAS standard big blue book. But there is a whole section on academic advising, and it was it's been updated, as you can see, multiple times on the 10th edition. And so there are spaces throughout the academic advising standards in the CAS book that speak about that speak to the commitment and professionalism values. They might not explicitly say that, but for example, we find evidence of the commitment core value in, let's look at this first excerpt from the CAS standards. The mission of academic advising programs is to assist students as they define, plan, and achieve their educational goals. Academic advising programs must advocate for student success and persistence. So that aligns pretty closely with the idea of being committed to our students, which is one of obviously the core value of commitment. There's also commitment to our colleagues. So the very next one, advising programs must collaborate with colleagues and departments across the institution. There are a lot of core values around ethics, which I know you guys had an integrity workshop last month, which I'm not going to go into integrity, but that is, if you were to lump three of them together, integrity would probably go with these two because they are very closely aligned. Integrity and ethics come up in the idea of professionalism and the idea of commitment, but mostly with professionalism. So in the whole, there's an ethics, legal, policy section in the CAS standards. And so you see professional development, human resources. So throughout all of the sections of the advising section of the CAS standards, you see this idea of commitment to the profession, commitment to students, commitment to the institution, commitment to colleagues, and then the idea of like sort of adhering to the values and standards of the field. And so the academic advising profession, this is one of the things that I mentioned that I think we need to talk about before we can actually talk about professionalism, and you'll see why. So if we look at the definitions of commitment and professionalism side by side, we see a key phrase here. So we see committed to the profession, and then values of the profession. And so when we're talking about academic advising and committing to the profession and adhering to the values of the profession, we have to sort of ask ourselves like what does the profession mean as far as academic advising? And the reason we have to ask ourselves that is because academic advising is a relatively young profession. It's been an occupation for a long time. It's been a component of people's jobs for a very long time. But academic advising as a proper profession is relatively new. And in fact, there are still scholars that debate whether academic advising has actually reached the standard of being a profession, and we'll talk about why. But whether or not academic advising is a profession matters with these these core values, because a lot of being a profession involves having rules and regulations according to like to regulate who enters and practices the profession, which, as we know, academic advising does not have. So it's a little, it's good to keep this in the back of our mind, thinking of like, what does this mean as we evolve as a profession? How might commitment to that profession and the values of our profession change and evolve over time? Because they will. And so the profession, as we say, I keep putting it in quotes, but the idea of advising as a profession is really important in understanding these two values. And then again, if we wanted to lump integrity in with this, I think we could do that as well. But there are a couple of, well, there are lots of people that have discussed what being a profession means. I've picked two articles that are both advising specific to talk about what it means to be a profession. And so on the left, we have what one author, a group of authors refer to as the process of professionalization. So the first is creating occupations. Okay, check, we did that. Establishing schools. Okay, we've got academic advising programs. That's great. Forming associations. Done. Ratifying codes. No. So ratifying codes roughly means that we have rules and regulations pertaining to our profession, that largely limit who can enter our profession, how they are allowed to practice, and then some sort of group that can take away or award or take away that recognition. Similarly, characteristics of an established profession include having education, so very similar to the establishing schools on the left side, sole jurisdiction. This is again something we don't have. It's very similar to ratifying codes. So when we talk about sole jurisdiction, we're talking about having an entity that can create standards that have teeth in them, let's say. So for example, like an accreditation body that says here are the standards for being an academic advisor. You're expected to adhere to these standards before you can become an academic advisor. You have to do these things, maybe take this credentialing exam, have this credential, and then you enter the field of academic advising as a profession. Self-regulation just means that that entity is allowed to award and take away and revise like accreditation or standards related to the profession. We've seen in other professions, sometimes there are multiple of these types of bodies that all work together to sort of just define what a profession means. And then public service is kind of an interesting characteristic of a profession that I hadn't considered before this, but most proper professions involve some component of serving a important function to the public, which academic advising does. So we've got lots of these, but we're just kind of missing some of those regulatory pieces that other professions have. And it's important to think about that because I wouldn't be surprised, and actually I know that this is in that conversations happen around this, but if academic advising and NACADA and other groups move towards this sort of adding that professional component that we don't really have, which is like sort of an accrediting body that could accredit both programs, right? Like academic advising programs that teach people to be academic advisors. It could accredit academic advising programs where people are advisors, right, in a setting, and could also oversee some sort of like licensure or something for academic advising. But when you look at other professions, social work, counseling, like closely related professions, teachers, social work, counseling, you see all, they all nursing, right? They all have some sort of body that makes sure that everybody that's entering the profession is trained similarly and has some sort of credential saying that they are able to practice that profession. And so I'm not going to go through all of this. It's just sort of a timeline of how architects became a profession because this is a really interesting one to think about because I think it formed in a similar way to academic advising. And so architects were originally carpenters. So I mean, it's really a nice alignment to think of when academic advisors were more prescriptive and didn't really do like the whole development piece. So a architect was a carpenter. The word architect comes from being a carpenter. They were just people that built stuff. And then a professional organization was created because they had lots of people that were building stuff and they were like, we need to get together and, like advocate for ourselves. And then that body really wanted them to be considered a profession. So they started creating educational programs to teach people. And then more programs that popped up, states realized like, whoa, we got to get a hold of this because people are being trained all different ways. So then regulatory boards start to form. And then about like almost 100, like 80 or so years later, after the first professional organization was created, there was a accrediting board for architects. So I'm not saying that we're going in that same direction, but we're kind of going in that same direction. It took like 80 years for architects to get there. So we'll see what happens with us. But I think as we see more academic advise, as we continue to see the professionalization of academic advising, we'll see more academic advising training programs at universities, more graduate level programs like similar to the program that I'm in, and then there might be a need for more of a like umbrella organization to oversee the field. Um, the reason that some of this happened with architects is because when you're building stuff, it matters if you're good at it, right? Because somebody that builds something that's bad is the people are going to get hurt, and that's what happened. People were getting hurt, right? So I don't know what it would take for academic advising to get to that point. Harm is not caused in quite the same way in an advising interaction, and I think that academic advising and a lot of institutions have done a really good job of training their academic advisors, and NACADA and the state organizations have done a really good job of providing professional development in the absence of a like regulatory body that says here's what you should study, here's what you need to know. When I started out as being an academic advisor at Washtenaw Community College, our whole advising team was counselors. So, like professional licensed counselors, and they were cross trained as academic advisors. And they hired part time academic advisors like me to to just be advisors to not also do counseling. But my training there was basically nothing, right? So that's why I wanted to come to Wayne State because I had read about the advising training academy, and I just had not had any real training in academic advising. And that was just like 8 years ago. And so we know that there are still institutions out there that are not training people in our profession. We're not educating people in our profession the way that they should. And then we also have different groups of advisors that may or may not feel like they're part of this profession at all, like faculty advisors. Advising is a part of their job, but a lot of them don't identify as advisors. So where do they see themselves when we're looking at these core competencies? Because we say that anybody that is a practicing advisor should follow these things, but we have a whole lot of people that don't because they've come to our they've come to our profession in multiple pathways. It's a component of their job and not their full job. They haven't been trained to understand the history and the theory, and the philosophy behind advising, and so they just don't connect with these values as much as those of us that have gone through extensive training in advising have. And so we'll talk about this as a group in a second here, but what does it mean for advising to be recognized as a profession? And we'll talk about this question here on the next slide, where I want to hear from you all. But like, what do the core values mean to an advisor that did not intentionally enter the academic advising field, or one that doesn't consider themselves part of the profession, or one that has not studied advising history or theory? And as we've become professionalized, we've got some wins, like, right, like we have a growing body of literature on academic advising, which is important because if we want people in our profession to study the literature of academic advising, somebody has to write that literature of academic advising. So the body of literature around advising is growing and continues to do so. We have more and more academic advising graduate programs for training and education purposes. And we do have standards, values, and competencies from NACADA and CAS and other organizations. But again, they don't, like, as I said, they don't really have like teeth to them, right? Because there's nobody to make us do these things. An individual institution could have rules about this, but there's no governing body that says like you have to adhere to these standards, or you can't be an advising program, or you can't be an academic advisor. And so those are the challenges. There's no universal training. There's no standard, across advising programs. There's no credentialing standards for programs that teach, programs that practice, individuals. And then another thing that makes this really challenging is academic advisors are called all different things. And so the lack of a consistent language around academic advising makes it really difficult for people to feel connected with the profession. I mentioned earlier that I'm hiring an academic advisor. That's not what it's actually called. This position at Grand Valley is actually called Student Services Coordinator, but they perform largely all of the actions of an academic advisor, but we call it something confusing. So it'll be difficult. That person might not realize right away. Like, I'll make sure they know they're an advisor, but they might not feel as connected to the profession because they are have this different title, and maybe they feel like, oh, that's not really me, right? And so this is just a quote from a recent-ish article about academic advising as a profession. There are lots of them, and I'll share resources afterwards. Well, I'll send the slides, and they all have the citations on them. But so everyone is a lot of people now want to say that it is a profession, despite the fact that we're missing some of these things. And part of the reason why is because we have a professional community with values and competencies in place, which is what this whole presentation is about. And so when Kate and I met to talk about this, I got all off on like a tangent and a like soapbox about this. But I would love to hear from folks just in the chat or unmute and just talk. Thinking about these, particularly these core competencies, the commitment to a profession, like that's asking a lot, right? And for those of us that entered the field on purpose, we expect to adhere to the standards of being an academic advisor. But lots of people fall into advising, and have come to advising with various, backgrounds, training, and professional development. And so, how can we really be, be a profession without a standard way of entering and navigating the field? And then more importantly, how do we ask advisors to commit to professional norms and values when their connection to the field might differ or feel unintentional for those people that do kind of fall into advising practice, or advising is like a small part of their job and not their full job? And I'll be quiet while people think if they want to talk or just reflect on this. Amanda said sessions like this are helpful in these ways. Absolutely. It helps get everybody on the same page. Where says, I think the falling into can make someone want to commit to norms even more. That's how I felt when I kind of fell into academic advising. It's like I was like, I want to know what to do. Like, what am I supposed to do? That's how I found NACADA by accident. My work didn't tell me about NACADA. I just sort of discovered it. But yeah, I wanted to know, like, what am I doing? What am I part of? Kate says, I wonder if they need to advise for a while before really knowing what they're committing to. Yeah, I mean, yeah, right. Like unlike other fields where people make a very intentional effort to, you don't just accidentally become a teacher or a nurse, right? You don't just like stumble into being a nurse. Like you know what you're getting into. You have to do lots of things before you get there and before you practice. And they let you like, do a little bit of practicing the practice first, right? To make sure that's what you want to do. But yeah. See, streamlining and standardization of training is helpful in defining what advising is. Oh yeah, Keith says making sure, that we're during the interview process that we're making sure we hire the right folks. Absolutely.
I think about, this is Laura Hetzler. I'm thinking also about the other sort of, there's NACADA, but there's also offshoot organizations that are advising for specific fields, right? And it does help as you think about this professionalism topic, if people in the field are aligned in terms of what a shared ethos is, what a shared ethical foundation of behavior is, because there's also for-profit companies that attempt to do what we do, but to make money off of it. And it's hard to kind of feel like those are in the same space. I'm thinking specifically around pre-health, but it's hard for me when you think about that public service piece that you put in there for one of the definitions. Like we are very much, especially in public institutions, doing service. When somebody else can pay for or buy that, I think it shifts a little bit kind of what that definition might mean for people who do it at an institutional level and people who do it in a for-profit company level.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Thank you, Laura. Let's see, Jessica said every institution has varying views of what advisors do. Ain't that the truth? Like that's part of the problem. And that's if you read all of the literature on the professionalization of academic advising, that concept comes up over and over and over again. That there's not even like really a shared definition of what academic advising is. I had the opportunity to be a discussant for a scholarly paper session at the last conference. And one of the authors of one of the papers was Dr. Craig McGill, who writes a lot on the professionalization of academic advising. And he's also one of my faculty members at Kansas State. So it was fun to get to critique his paper for a change. But one of the things that I talked about in my discussant remarks were about the idea that academic advising has to happen in higher education, because that's part of, if you've ever read like the core competencies guide. I was one of the reviewers for the second edition of the core competencies guide, and there's a part where it says like advising happens in higher ed. It's like stated more eloquently that, but when I was reviewing it, I had never thought about it before, but I circled it and I said, why? Like other professions aren't limited to a specific location. Like a social worker is a social worker, whether they're practicing in a school or a hospital or a nonprofit. Like, why is academic advising limited to institutions of higher education? And so that I talked about that during that presentation about like the profession of academic advising. And I said, maybe that's something else we need to think about is like, is that limiting us, other people seeing us as a legitimate profession? Because sort of like an unofficial definition of a profession is that people know what it is when you talk about it. Like we know what an architect is. Like you don't have to imagine, like, right? If somebody says they're an architect, you're like, you might not have like a fully fleshed out idea of what that is, but like we know, right? Like they draw, blueprints of buildings, help carpenters put it together, right? Like we have an idea of what a carpenter does or a architect does, but with advising, how many of us have had to explain to somebody what that is? Like someone that's outside of higher ed, like what it is that we do. So it just the field just doesn't have like a you know, a comprehensive view of what this is. So that's problematic also. Let's see, reading the comments here. Advising is doing more good deeds for our students, especially as we were honest and supportive at the same time. Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of this is, you know, is supporting students and the greater good of students, like both of these core competencies. He said, right now, it's what you make it to be. Yeah, absolutely. And then we have to think too, like, and I think I have this in a later slide. So if I might be getting ahead of myself, and I apologize if I am, but like we have to think, are we it in regulating the profession more, like what are we losing, right? Like one of the things that makes advising really cool is that people do come to it from all different backgrounds, that you can have you know, an advisor that had a STEM degree advising STEM students. Like that's really awesome. And so you know, are we losing that by, you know, sort of gatekeeping the profession, which is what would essentially happen if we did have more you know, rigorous professional standards. I agree, Laura. I think they strengthened us. So I'm very conflicted because like I think that we want to be recognized as a valid profession. And you know, and especially if we're committing, like so we're saying commit to the profession, but like what? Commit to, like, what does that mean, right? But I agree. I think that that's what makes advising really cool. All right. Well, thanks for indulging me on the philosophical kind of piece of this. I'll move on. And so, all right, so we'll go into kind of breaking down the different components of each of these core values. And so commitment, there's the definition again on the left. And then I just kind of pulled out some of like the key parts of this. And so of course the commitment to all the people that were committed to students, colleagues, institutions, and again, the profession, assessing academic advising and committing to, you know, we're saying we're committed to all of these people, right? And institutions, but you know, how do we know that we are? How do we know we're doing what we're supposed to do to support students? So that's where the assessment of academic advising becomes very important. I'm glad that it's explicitly outlined in this this core value. Scholarly inquiry again is a way that we commit to the advising profession in particular, and then lifelong learning and professional development, which I think all of us in this room are really good at because you're here right now. So, and Kate makes it easy to do with the Advising Training Academy is that, you know, you have easy access to professional development in the advising field. And so commitment and action, I won't read through every single one of these, but I will send these out afterwards. That's why I made this a little bit more like wordier than I might normally have done. But when we think about committing to students, I think this is where we all shine, right? Like if people do really, really good job of being committed to their students. It's as you go down the list that it gets a little bit harder, right? So you're supporting student success, advocating for students, helping students craft meaningful educational experiences, helping them meet their goals, their career and educational goals. Advisors are great at that. Commitment to colleagues, we're still pretty good at that, but maybe not as great, right? Sharing best practices and providing mentorship, fostering a collaborative community, that is, and a highlight on that values diverse perspectives. I think that piece does not always is not always uh, evident when people are working in groups, not just advisors, anybody, you know, valuing especially like voices that are not as loud as some, and then actively participating in groups to build a stronger network of advisors, so professional organizations, but also like more local organizations like NACADA, you know, as a more local group, or being involved with the ATA, the professional development opportunities, just so we have a better idea of who our colleagues are and knowing what they might need, how do they need to be supported, and how do we commit to that. Committing to institutions, this is hard because it's like we're expected to do this, but this is often at odds with the other ones, which we'll talk about later on, how commitment to the institution does not always align with commitment to yourself and to your students. But so when we're thinking about committing to the institution that we work for, we're looking at how we align our advising practices with the institutional mission, while also advocating for like the removal of systemic barriers that make it difficult for students to move through our programs as they should. And I couldn't even get that whole sentence out without being critical of the institution. So I did a bad job at this. But that's the problem, right? Is that there's a lot in our institutions that need a lot of work. And that's why advocacy is so important from academic advisors. But we're we're supposed to be committed to our institution, but we also see all of the problems that are here. And so, really thinking about how do we navigate this space, especially from different perspectives. So people that are practicing advisors, might be committed to the institution in one way, someone that's an advising administrator in another way, someone that's a faculty, advisor in yet another way, someone that's a success coach, very closely aligned field, might be committed to the institution in a different way. When I was a success coach, I was not committed to my institution at all. Like I was like for the students, and that meant arguing with everybody about everything because that was like what my job was. But it's a little bit different as you kind of move into the space where you are negotiating with academic units on things. And so you can't just, kind of come in like a wrecking ball, so to speak. But and then when thinking about committing to the institution, also, highlighting the value of advising to people that make decisions on, resource allocation, and then participating in the things that are available to us, so that way the institution will continue to invest in in things like this, right? It's easy for Kate to make a case on why the ATA needs to exist because she holds events and people come to them, and we have a really good group of advisors because of it. But if people didn't come, it'd be a lot harder to make an argument that this was needed. And then commitment to the profession. One of the best ways that we can do that is by engaging in scholarly research. If you have a question that you've wondered about, write about it. That's hard because, as staff, it's difficult to get things like IRB approval to do research, but it's not impossible. And just contributing to the research in academic advising, presenting at conferences, sharing innovative practices through like writing blogs for NACADA or academic advising today. Articles are pretty accessible. And then serving in leadership roles when able in organizations like MIACADA and NACADA, which this group is super good at. So I don't even need to talk about that in detail. Lots of MIACADA members here. Assessment, using data to improve advising effectiveness and demonstrate the impact. And again, the scholarly inquiry is just sort of like a component of all of this. When we think of professional development and lifelong learning, again, it aligns very closely with the idea of being committed to the profession. You're staying current on, updated trends and research and literature in the field, advocating for the profession, again, understanding why advising is important to the health of an institution and sharing the story of academic advising with administrators and others outside of the field so people know what advising is. So we could be like architects where we say like we're an advisor and people know what that means. And investing, encouraging investment and advising when able, like if you're ever in a space, where somebody hears you and you are a decision maker or have the ability to influence decision makers, just encouraging more resources and training, and then also recognition, which often doesn't cost anything, right? At the institutional level, and at the national level if you're working at that space. But let's see. Does anyone have anything to add? Like what actions you can take to show commitment? Anything I forgot? I'll trust I got everything. I probably didn't, but all right, professionalism. Now this is fun. I think it's fun. I don't know if you guys think it's fun. So again, breaking it down, the values of the profession, which is literally what we're talking about now, the core values, but also again the values come up in other documents that aren't labeled values, like the core competencies and the CAS standards, and then various other resources that we develop that talk about like advising syllabi and things like that, that talk about what we value as a profession. And then, working for the greater good of students, colleagues, institutions, and higher ed. So again, basically the same four groups that the commitment value focuses on: students, colleagues, institution, and higher ed. So we kind of start small and they get more like macro. So there's lots of alignment here. So before I talk very like more in depth about professionalism, I like just can't not address just the concept of professionalism in the first place. Professionalism the idea of professionalism has been challenged lately, which is great, because it needs to be. The traditional idea of who is a professional and who's not, and what makes someone a professional, what is professional behavior, what does professionalism look like, is really started to change over the years. Some of it is just come by different professions being more diverse and people being like, hey, your professional stand, like your idea of professionalism doesn't work for me. COVID also changed some of this, right? So being a professional looked one way. I wear jeans like every day now. I have not gone back to wearing work pants. Like I have jeans on now. Like I'm like loafers, jeans, a blazer, like every day. Nice jeans, like dark wash jeans, but so some of that changes, and I'm like, I could do my job just as good in jeans as I can in dress pants. So, but I don't wear dresses at all. Like that's just not a part of my wardrobe here. But lots of things have changed that help us challenge professionalism. Laura, perfect boss outfit. That's what I thought too. It's like kind of like a tech bro, like look, I'm like if they can do it, I can do it. But anyways, so just thinking about, so professionalism is one of the core values for NACADA, but we really have to be careful when we think about what does that actually mean for us. And I think NACADA's definition is very good. And it's not problematic. But when we say the word professionalism, there's lots of things that come to mind. Particularly that the idea of professionalism is largely based on white male Western ideals, right? The reason why people wear dress pants, right, is because that's what men wear, right? And so what professionalism has meaned historically, people are starting to get away from. It's like, why do I have to wear a dress or dress pants to work? Like I don't. I can wear jeans and that's fine. Or I can wear my hair a certain way. Comes up a lot. Unfortunately, things like dress codes and other codes that we see this in schools, but we also see it in different workplaces depending on the industry and the profession. But around expectations or rules, not even just expectations, but rules around what people wear, how people wear their hair. There wouldn't be rules around this, but just sort of assumptions about people and how they talk or their accents, food choices, like lots of things where people might act in one way and people are like, that's not professional. And then you have to really ask yourself why. I'm interviewing for an assistant, and last week we had interviews, and one of the gentlemen that I interviewed, he was like, he was in like khakis and like a polo or something. I don't know. I don't care. But somebody said like, he was the only one that wasn't dressed professionally, and I was like, what? I was like, I don't even know I don't even remember what he had on. But people see that. People like make assumptions, and this was also a person of color. So like, you have to think like, are people being more critical of people that they already think are not meeting their professional standards? So we talked about that, like in afterwards. I was like, this doesn't matter to me. And it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter to you. But that's some of the feedback from the people on my search committee. And it just highlighted for me how problematic this idea of professionalism still is. And so when we think about inclusive professionalism, so this stuff came from an article from NACE, I don't know how it's pronounced, the National Association of College Employers. So like like the career center counterpart for NACADA, so to speak. But they talk a lot about executive presence. So like thinking of like who looks and feels like they can be a boss, right? And why does that person look and feel? What is it about that person that makes us think that they can do a job, and particularly higher level jobs? And so really thinking about like what does it mean to be like, practice cultural humility, cultural competencies, challenging biases in workplace norms. Like why do we need dress codes? No, probably not. Like I tell people dress for the day you have, right? And so do we need like a rule that says something? Probably not. And what does the rule, like there are students that, there are schools that have dress codes that are like, can't wear head coverings. Like, what does that mean? Right? Like that means a whole lot of things. Or that there's schools that don't let kids wear their hair in braids, or all sorts of different things. And so we see it a lot in K-12 schools because they have a lot more defined definitions, but those ideas seep into the workplace too. And so just kind of reflecting on this idea, and if anybody wants to share, feel free to put in the chat or unmute and talk. But just thinking of how do we, how do advisors as a profession, like define professionalism in a way that's equitable and inclusive, particularly for academic advisors as the field gets more and more diverse. Part of this article also talks about teachers, like K-12 teachers, who have historically been mostly white women, and sort of the idea of like what being professional looks like for them as a field, but also for the students that they're working with, like what are they instilling in the students? And it made comparisons to higher education. And talked about like it in another article I read talked about advisors being very similar, right? That's been historically like a white woman dominated field. And so what does that mean when we're thinking about not just professionalism for ourselves and our colleagues, but our students? Because a lot of what we're doing is trying to help students get a job, right? Helping them be employable. And so what does that mean when we're talking to students about being a professional, and how do, biases and things like that sort of creep in? And how do we balance high standards, with authenticity when we're thinking about being professional? Ooh, Laura, thanks. Laura put a link in the club, also from NACE, NACE, uh, professionalism. Yep. Yeah. That's why I had to grab it from them, because they talk about this. I couldn't really find any like NACADA stuff about this. About this idea, but I figured that NACE would have it because they work with employers, right? So they are really always thinking about like what gets people hired. It's a behavior focused, not appearance focused. That's great.
I was gonna say, we talk a lot within like our pre-med and health science centers of high needs population, prone to shopping around for answers. And so a lot of it, we talk about just the confidence that you have to have. And so this is a high trust field. And to Laura's point about being behavior focused and not appearance focused, but how do you exude confidence? Even when you're saying, let me get back to you on that, I want to make sure to give you the right information, but it's just about exuding trust and confidence in your response. Otherwise, some students will eat you alive.
See right through you.
Once you lose their trust, like nothing you tell them what time of day it is will be trusted, and they'll just move on to someone else. So anyway, just to
That's a great
reinforce
point.
that is more about what you do than how you look.
Great. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Any other thoughts on sort of reimagining professionalism in advising in particular? It's just good to think about as we talk about like committing to values. And this is one of the values. So like, what are we committing to when we say we're committing to professionalism? Like what, I mean, they define, NACADA defines it, but like really, what does that mean? Like, what are we agreeing to do by saying that we are following the core values? And one of them is like kind of problem, has a history of being problematic, let's say. So it's just something to think about as you contemplate how you might, do the core values, like they look like an action for you. Sean, the Crown Act passed in Michigan was a big step regarding cultural conflicts. Yes, that was about hair in schools. I mentioned it like a little offhandedly, but thank you, Sean. If you haven't read about the Crown Act, it's a great. I mean, it's sad that this has to happen, but it was a win for sure, to stop schools from discriminating against students. I mean, students were getting sent home from school because of how their hair looked, and people are like, "This is just how my hair grows out of my head. Like, what do you want from me?" Right? Yeah. All right. Right, now that we got that out of the way, professionalism in action. Let's assume it's all great, and that we don't have any cultural competency problems with professionalism, which we do, but we'll just move ahead, assuming that we've solved all of those problems. And so when the way NACADA defines this again, upholding the standards and values. So applying these core values and CAS standards in our daily work. The CAS standards are an interesting read if you haven't read them. Some of it's not super applicable to people every day. Like there's a whole like fiscal section, like facilities. And I was like, I have to deal with facilities now because I have a building that I have to get managed sort of. But before I was like, I don't really care about facilities very as much, except for unless you're having a facility problem, then all of a sudden you care a lot about the facilities. But there's a lot of parts in the CAS, the advising section of the CAS book, and also other sections of the CAS standards book that are really interesting and kind of give a lot of detail on like how to do some of this stuff. And then again, I mentioned that the ethics integrity value weaves its way into the professionalism aspect, because a lot of what being a professional means is acting responsibly and being ethical in our interactions with our students, colleagues, institutions, all the people that we say we're working for the greater good for. And so the way we do that is by doing what we're supposed to do to the best of our ability, and doing it in an ethical, compassionate, culturally sensitive way. Engaging in professional development, this comes up in both values, so it's here again, but attending conferences and webinars, workshops, pursuing certifications, credentials, formal training and advising if you don't get it through your institution, which all of you do here, which is great. And then again, collaborating with colleagues, sharing best practices, mentorship, offering supportive being part of a supportive community, creating a supportive community if there's not one there for you. And so, again, there's a lot of overlap with what some of this like sort of looks like in action between the two values. Again, more professionalism in action. So again, to go back to what we just talked about, challenging traditional professionalism. That's not like NACADA didn't say that, but I'm saying that. So if we see places, where there are bias we're noticing this in our workplace norms, or worse, if it's not norms, like rules that are biased up towards groups of people, it's particularly because we're talking about professionalism related to this. I mean, it could be again for us or towards our students, but identifying and calling it out if we see it, advocating for inclusive definitions of professionalism that celebrate diverse identities and pathways. And one thing that I think is important too is just like telling people what those are, right? Like I think that, in the absence of a dress code, like if you have a dress code, I don't like dress codes, but like dress codes are problematic, but also in the absence of one, people like think that they need to, act and dress a certain way. So, if there's a way to let people around like this is not the expectation. Like when I have staff here, there's unless like the president of the university's come in, like we don't need to wear anything other than jeans. And so making sure that people know that, and so they're not just like left to wonder, because people will sort of gravitate towards the traditional definition of professionalism when left to their own devices, and that's almost everybody, like regardless of race, gender, like we all just have that is the idea of being a professional. And if you ask someone like what a professional looks like, or a CEO, what does a CEO look like? What are the the defining characteristics of a CEO? They're probably going to be characteristics that align with white men, to be frank. Let's see, Michelle. Professionalism has nothing to do with one's appearance. I know some who are dressed to the nines professionally, but not are very professional. That's a great point. Like to the opposite, right? Like dressing professional does not make you professional at all. They're just clothes. On the other hand, had a boss who was very professional and wore Birkenstocks every day. That's great. Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. That's a great point. No, but that is a really good point. Like just putting on professional clothes doesn't make us act professionally. Does it make us better at our jobs? It doesn't make us more knowledgeable. Does it make us act more ethically? Okay. Advocating for the profession again, this comes up in both areas. So thinking about how advising is important as a professional field and how we should demand it be treated as such in our institutions. Highlighting the value of like letting people that are not part of the advising workforce, so to speak. I'm letting them know people from academic affairs, assistant deans, folks from other divisions and departments, like letting them know when applicable that advising has standards and values and competencies, and like this is a legitimate field. This isn't something that people do kind of stumble into this, but particularly at Wayne State, like this is like a thing, right? It's not just something, and I think people really discount academic advising, particularly when we're talking about faculty and administrators, and they it's like, oh, you're just helping people pick classes. Well, like no, like there's a whole field of study, there's a whole field of literature, like this is a profession, and it's in we should value it as such within the institution. So really just like advocating for the profession, knowing that we have all of these things that make us a valuable profession, and then encouraging folks to engage with professional organizations whenever you can, engaging yourself, and contribute to advancing the field in whatever way makes sense for you. You guys already added some stuff about professionalism and action in the chat, but anything else that I forgot? Ways that we can demonstrate professionalism? Great. Moving right along. So this is a kind of goes back to the redefining professionalism aspect. And again, I'll send this out so you guys can click on the link for this article if you want. But this is an article about, whoops. Harry, pick up school. I'm not picking up Harry today. I don't know if it popped up on everybody's screen, but I just got a notification that said pick up Harry from school. It's my son, but my husband's getting him because I'm here. But so this is an article about it's the topic is really called like whiteness at work, and it is about specifically about academic advising. This is the other article that I referenced earlier that made a comparison to K-12 teachers and how some of the professional like norms that we have in the education field in K-12 sort of come from a white Western, background, and in academic advising and higher ed is very similar because the workforce honestly looks very similar, and is sort of evolved in a similar way. And so this the quote I highlighted a couple of the spots here that I thought were interesting, but particularly it says the mechanisms of so-called professional behaviors and attributes that obscure whiteness and its insidious impact also exist in academic advising within post-secondary education. And again, it's like comparing to K-12 education. And I like the like so-called professional behavior and attributes because that's what we've been talking about is like, what does that even mean, right? And then it talks about how to challenge what academic advisors can do to challenge these so-called professional behaviors and attributes within our organization to help rid us from these problems with professionalism. And so we've got about a half an hour left, and so I wanted to hear from everybody as like a big group, and then I have like a breakout type like case study thing. Don't leave if you're a person that likes to like sit quietly and listen. I'll make sure the breakout groups are big enough where you could still do that without leaving, so don't feel like you have to jump out. I've definitely done that before. They say we're going to the breakout groups, and I'm like, click, leave meeting. Like I'm not talking. But don't feel like you have to do that. These are not going to be like 4 people groups. But first, let's like break the ice, so to speak, with getting ready for the breakout rooms with a large group discussion. And so, again, there's a lot of overlap between the commitment and professionalism values, particularly with the commitment to, and working for the greater good of students, colleagues, institution, the profession. And so and then also like the advocacy piece is kind of relevant through both. But so 2 questions just to sort of think about. Identify one actionable way advisors can demonstrate both commitment and professionalism in their daily work. So think of, some of the things we talked about: professional development, advocacy, mentoring, advancing equity, challenging professionalism, whatever. And then it's just from your own example, like where have you seen these values sort of come up in your work? And I don't want to it's very easy to get into like sort of the ethical piece because a lot of this is ethics. But so if that's your example, then great. But also try to, you can also think of things that maybe are not necessarily like an ethical dilemma. But thinking of like where have we been expected to be committed to a student, be committed to colleagues, be committed to our institution. And where does Wayne State do that really well? And what areas could Wayne State improve on? Like at Wayne State, like advising community improve on sort of living these values.
I can start. It might sound simple, but I think a lot of it's about bringing your best self to work every day for your students. And I know many of us have counseling backgrounds, but not all, but it's that whole idea of that student gets that half hour or 20 minutes or whatever they've arrived for. And so whatever's going on in your world, in your life, finding a way to set that aside because that student, isn't aware of that, doesn't need to know that they get that 30 minutes for themselves, and focusing on that and bringing your best self to that interaction. So kind of simple, but I think that's a way of showing commitment to your profession and professionalism.
Thank you.
Can I build on that?
Yeah.
It's sometimes it's bringing that piece. It's bringing your best self, which means maintaining that you're present in the moment. And one of the things that I've evolved over time, I think that really connects with doing my best work, both for the university and for the student, is, a student might come in with a question about something, right? And a lot of times students don't know what they don't know. But as an advisor, I might, I have to both be present to what they're asking and not make assumptions, right? About this is another, you see so many people that they turn up with the same issues. It feels like a little wash, rinse, repeat, and kind of trying to meet each student while they're at it in that moment. But also, if there is something that you notice that the student might not bring up, but could be an issue for future, right? A student who's talking about adjusting their winter registration, let's say, and you're talking about course planning and they're adjusting their winter registration because they are, they failed a class, right? Having that longer conversation, taking the most of the 30 minutes they have and giving them the best of your advice, context about things that they might not have thought about, or we're just going to talk about classes. Well, let's talk about, why are you pursuing this path anyhow? Instead of just the 10 minutes that it's going to take to shift your course, well, why are you picking this major? What do you want to do with that? What are you doing to engage outside the classroom? Like, for me, that is sort of embodying my commitment to my students and holding myself to the highest standards that I feel as a professional advisor. Yes, I'm going to call myself a professional. But that's where I see that kind of on the daily in my own practice, in my own life.
Thank you. It's a wonderful explanation. Right. Got some stuff in the chat. Susie said, advocating for students in situations that seem wrong. Ah, that is so perfectly stated. Asking questions for students and trying to give the student the best and least frustrating experience. Absolutely. Moria says, yeah, just reinforces what Laura said about how even the simplest questions have a lot more to them. There's a lot behind the question that we can, address, even if that's not what the student asked us. That is part of being a professional, is that you can anticipate those, right? Like, you hear a student say something and you have enough experience to know that it could lead to X, Y, and Z. And so, like, why wait until X, Y, and Z happens? Let's talk about it now. Absolutely.
I think one thing that the university has been very good about is, which I think it helps me to stay committed, is it asks advisor opinion on topics that range, the gamut. The thing they could approve on is sometimes following up with that and following through with some of the ideas that have been put forward, or if nothing else, maybe even giving us a better understanding or a context for why they went in a particular direction with certain decisions that they make, that affect students, that affect advisors very much directly. I know that, and I think that's part of commitment also is, there have been several circumstances where I've spoken up. It maybe politically wasn't the right thing for me to do at the time, but it was the right thing for our students to have done at the time. And I think that is me demonstrating my commitment to my position more than to my own personal, betterment, as far as like moving forward at the university or doing something I might have put myself in maybe a negative a negative light in some way because of something I've said. But if I know that it's right for the student, I feel that is part of the commitment.
Right. Yeah, it really shows when those things are at odds with each other, right? Like, a lot of this is contradictory. It's like, can I be committed and work for the greater good of all of these things at the same time? Like, sometimes the answer is no. And Michelle, what you said about, like, being the Wayne State asking for advisors, opinions on things. I mean, I really thought Wayne State was a great place to work for being an academic advisor, because those things do happen. And I do feel like academic advisors, generally speaking, are looked at as professionals at Wayne State, and that a lot of different people and groups on campus value the opinions of academic advisors, and really, see advisors as professionals. And that helps, because how can you be committed to an institution that doesn't value you? Like, you really can't. Cleo said participation in the ATA assists us with aligning best practices. Yes, which can be helpful if we have different professional backgrounds. Absolutely. Absolutely. What's this one? Keith said Wayne is great at allowing advisors to grow personally and professionally through professional development, mentorship, and trainings. It wasn't the case in the 90s if you were here at Wade, so the profession has grown for sure. I'm sure that it has changed drastically. I mean, I, like many other people, became an academic advisor because I had a terrible advising experience as an undergrad. So the advising looked totally different then. I didn't have an assigned advisor. Like, it just went, whoever saw me, saw me. We had faculty advisors. I changed my major like 7 times. So how does a faculty advisor help you when you change your major over and over again? They can't. Anyone else want to talk about what Wayne State is doing well? What advisors or the advising community is doing well? Or areas that could use some improvement? Right. Well, let's get to it. All right.
I can speak to maybe one of the little elephants in the room is
Yeah.
the hiring of 40, 45 advisors that all kind of came on and now maybe top of rank, and the lack of growth from there. So kind of not thinking long-term about the professional development beyond what the typical, 2 to 3 promotional steps, and then what, and so what would that look like? What could that look like? That could help an advisor advance or have a little bit of additional growth. So, yeah. And maybe because there's not a lot of model for it, or there isn't, I've seen different things at different schools, but how does that fit with what we've already established?
Yeah. That comes up in some of the professionalization of advising literature too, like the career ladders,
Yeah.
so to speak. Yeah. And what does that look like? And the lack of, the lack of a career ladder, does that show that, that we don't like, we don't value this? And then it's hard too. I mean, Wayne State is great where you've got, different levels of, being an academic advisor that you can move through. But of course, yeah, you said what happens when you cap out, you get to the top of your rank, and then what, right? And for people that want to move up, like what does that look like? Like middle management positions that may or may not exist. Do we create them? Which then there's also, you know, uh, criticism of like administrative bloat. Like, do we need more associate directors, assistant vice deans or whatever, right? They're called, so like, what does that like look like in practice? Like, what does it look like when somebody moves up? Yeah, I don't know. Great comments, everybody. All right. So again, we just kind of already touched on this. Like some of the challenges here is like this kind of conflict and tension between what's the best for all these different groups that we're supposed to be committed to and working for the greater good of. Balancing advocacy with systemic barriers, which are part of our institutions, which is a group that we're supposed to be committed to and working for the greater good of. What do we do when the other things we're supposed to do are at odds with our institution, which happens very often. Challenges again, the problematic nature of just the idea of professionalism and like what does that actually mean in practice. And then this last one again is what we talked about a little bit, but a challenge to all of this is how do you ensure advisors commit to the values, standards, competencies of a profession when there's not really like a uniform centralized way that they enter the profession. Like there's no checkpoint to say, okay, you did this, this, and now you're an advisor. You catch people later and say, hey, now you've got to learn, you because you took this job, you agree to do all this stuff, right? And people are like, well, I didn't want to do that, right? Like there might be people that want to just help people pick classes, and they're like, I didn't sign up for all this other stuff, right? And so what does that look like? We can't just have a regulatory body update the standards and then everybody just has to do it, right? Like, it takes a lot of work to get the word out or sort of organically through schools. All right. So I would like to put people in breakout rooms, just like 3. Kate, can we do like just like 2 or 3 breakout rooms? I might have the ability to do it, but I'll see if I can.
How many minutes?
Just like 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay,
So
I'll do 3 breakout rooms.
like 10, 12
Um,
people each, so nobody has to panic.
Yep.
You can still be a
Are you
passive
ready?
observer.
Oh,
I'll read this first and then I'll
Okay.
discuss it first and then we can do it. But so it's just like a little, like a very brief case study about a student who's struggling in her STEM major, wants to be an engineer, but she's thinking about switching to a less rigorous major so she can keep her high GPA and stay on track for graduation. The institution, however, has a lot of STEM retention initiatives happening. It's a big strategic goal of the university or college to retain students in STEM fields, probably particularly like underrepresented students, like a woman would be in engineering. Um, and so you as the advisor, you're also thinking of like yourself and what you and your colleagues have the capacity to do as a student that's struggling or making a lot of changes, needs more support, more time, more advocacy. And so just thinking about these and what we've talked about, where do you see disconnects between what's best for the student, institution, advisor, colleagues, profession, any of that? How can advisors demonstrate both commitment to students and professionalism while navigating these kind of conflicts? And what strategies would you use to address the different priorities while supporting the student and also staying aligned with institutional goals? And I have put these, I'll stop sharing my screen for a second, and I'll put them in the chat too. So see if everybody's gone. Like it. All right. Welcome back, everyone. So we've only got a few minutes left, but just wanted to hear, this is more about you guys talking to each other and less about reporting out. But did anybody want to share anything about what your group discussed? Any disconnects you identified? Were you in agreement on what should be prioritized? Like, did some people think this should be commitment to this aspect should be, prioritized over commitment to this other, entity? And did anything like actionable come up, like something that might be useful in actual
Shawntae,
practice?
I'll
Go,
go.
hi, Cleo.
Hey, nice to see you.
You too.
And so one thing that we came up with was, looking at that GPA, like where exactly is that student, what is their goal? And we also talked a lot about possible external challenges when meeting a student where they are, like what external challenges are affecting the student. What exactly is happening with the student? Is it so important for them to graduate with that particular or that specific major? And if you did like a dive into their credits and what they've had so far, this person could be in engineering, but they've had to repeat math courses. And so, looking at the whole picture and seeing where we could assist, but at the same time, thinking about the needs of the university and the needs of the department, but keeping, advocating for the student first, keeping that in mind.
You. Anyone else from any of the other groups? Or someone from Cleo's group want to add something different?
One of the things that occurred to me and that we talked about too is that it sort of, there feels like there's a disconnect, but when you drill down and look at, okay, if a student stays in this major, which gives you the numbers, they might not be successful, which is a loss to the university. It's like sort of advocating for the university over the student could end up being a lose-lose situation. So sometimes it seems like there's a disconnect when maybe there's not so much.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
We also talked about what resources are available to a student. Like with this being a STEM field, what resources are there? Is there specific tutoring available that would assist the student in the STEM field? Is a success coach available that can be there for students?
Wonderful. Thank you. Anyone else? Feel free to put stuff in the chat too if you'd like. All right. So that is it basically. What I have, which is good because we're like basically out of time. But just does anybody have any like parting thoughts or reflections or questions for me or for the group about any of the stuff that we talked about today?
How many of your faculty in your PhD program are advisors or former advisors?
Oh, yeah. No, it's a great question. Most most of them.
Okay.
Most of them, yeah. There are a couple that aren't. So like my advisor, like my dissertation chair is not a practicing advisor, but she teaches in the department, but she has like a math background and she teaches our stats classes. So we got a couple of people that are,
Okay.
like that. And then we also have some crossover with like the student affairs and educational leadership program. And so a lot of those faculty, they're not in our like the program necessarily, but we take classes with them. So their like expertise might lie in other areas of like higher ed student affairs type groups. But yeah, but like yeah, most of our main faculty for the advising program were practicing advisors. And Craig McGill that I mentioned earlier is one of our, he's got a master's degree in academic advising, right? Like
Okay.
and he was a practicing advisor for years before he moved into faculty. So yeah.
All right, well, feel free to
Yeah.
put your name and access ID in the chat if you haven't done that already. I can get the attendance list as well. But a huge Wayne State Warrior thank you to Shawntae for bringing her expertise and her talent with her today to have this discussion. And I just appreciate all of you taking your time this week to join us. And with that, we will say goodbye and I'll do some follow-up with the certificates after this. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Thanks.
Shawntae.